Hello, everybody. Hello. Welcome in. We did take a week off last week, but we're very excited to come back. Welcome in to Conversations with Authors. Today, we are here to bring you Andrew Lawler and his newest book, Under Jerusalem, I believe. The book today, we're actually quite excited about it. It seems like a lot of you are very excited about it as well. But nonetheless, before we get to our authors properly, allow me to welcome you back to Book Passages Conversations with Authors. If you've seen one of these events before, well then welcome back. I'm very glad to see you here. But if you're new here, then Book Passage is a group of independently run bookstores out of the San Francisco Bay Area, and we host and run book talks just like these very often throughout the week. Sometimes in person, actually more and more we are running them in person, particularly in our Corte Madera store, although let me tell you, we have been scheduling a lot of ferry building stores throughout the week, so if you happen to enjoy the San Francisco Bay Area, we are hosting more and more book talks. And as you have seen before this video, if you were here waiting for the screen to start and you saw that banner rotating through, we're hosting a number of ticketed events, all of which you can find at bookpassage.com. But most importantly, as particularly for this, we are streaming now on YouTube, and we'll continue to do so in the future, events just like this one. So if you do enjoy yourself today, remember to click the subscribe button just below the video. It's completely free to you, and it really helps us out to know which kind of content that you liked, and it also helps you out, particularly if you click that bell next to the subscribe button. It will alert you every time we go live with author conversations just like these, and you might even find something that you didn't know you would enjoy. If you do like to check out our upcoming events, or you like the idea of being part of our email newsletter, you can find that at bookpassage.com or linked below in the description. And if you'd like to check out particularly tonight's book, but any of the books that happen to be mentioned here tonight, you can find it below in the description. There's a big link that says buy the book, and that'll take you right to the page. Lastly, and this is very important, if you would like to ask any questions tonight, you have to write them in the YouTube chat. It's just to the right of the screen or just below the screen. That is how I will find your questions, and that's how I will take them in, and that's how I will ask them to the author. Okay, so make sure you write them down as you think of them, and you'll be able to get them. You'll be able to get them in, and you'll be able to actually ask your question. It'll be very nice. All right, now allow me to introduce Andrew Lawler. Our featured book tonight, Under Jerusalem, takes readers into the tombs, tunnels, and trenches of the Holy City. It brings to life the indelible characters who have investigated this subterranean landscape. Acclaimed journalist and the book's author, Andrew Lawler, reveals how the investigation not only defined the conflict over modern Jerusalem, but could provide a map for peoples and multiple faiths to peacefully exist. Andrew Lawler is the author of the best-selling The Secret Token, Myth, Obsession, and the Search for the Lost Colony of Roanoke, and the acclaimed Why Did the Chicken Cross the World? The epic saga of the bird that powers civilization. That sounds good. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and National Geographic. He's a writer for Science, a contributing editor for Archaeology. Also, the overlords, the Book Passage overlords, want me to tell you that we have signed copies of this book if you order it. Big bold letters at the bottom of my introduction. I wonder who added that. Additionally, in conversation tonight, we have a good man who maybe has a little bit of technical issues with the camera today. It's not his fault. It's not really anybody's fault. It's just one of those days with the internet. That's the way it goes. But we have Eli Raymer. I should have asked here tonight. Coming on in, but welcome to the both of you. Thank you for coming in. Welcome to Book Passage, everybody. Come on in.
Thank you very much, Nick. It's a pleasure to be here, and just a shout out to independent bookstores like Book Passage that have done so much for us during the pandemic. So just continue to support a store that provides that community with some good reading. So I'm happy to be here with my old and very dear friend, Eli Raymer. Hi, how are you tonight, Eli?
I am good. I am honored and delighted to be here, even though I am fuzzy on the screen.
I've never known you to be fuzzy before, so this is quite a surprise.
Oh, marvelous. I'm glad that it's happened in that case. And it's wonderful to be here because I have been reading your work for literally decades, following your articles, reading your books. And one of the things that strikes me particularly is that you have an amazing ability to do two things that some writers can't do. to be expansive, to get the big picture, and also to be really focused and get all the fine details in. Some authors can do one but not the other, and some can do the other but not the first. You're such an artist at doing both, and so I'm just thinking about this journey. I love show and tell, so I am thinking about what you did in this book, which was a global story focused on one species. And yet you told this amazing story. And then in The Secret Token, you focused on one community, almost an unknown story that has resonance all through the United States and across the planet. And I'm curious, given your background, how did you get to this book? What brought you to Jerusalem? How much time have you spent there? What was the seed within you that thought of all the things as a genius that you could write about, and you've written about so much, this is my next book?
Well, I could say that I was dragged kicking and screaming, but that might be understating the matter. Well, I've been writing about archaeology, as you know, for many years, primarily in the Middle East, but I had always wanted to avoid Jerusalem. It just seemed so complicated. All the politics and the religion, and I just didn't really want to get involved in all that because it felt so fraught, so challenging. So I would go off to other countries that seemed a little bit simpler, and was able to write about things that happened 3,000 years ago, and that was fun. But then something changed. I do remember a day that I was in Israel for a conference, an archaeology conference, and an archaeologist friend of mine said, "Hey, why don't we go to Jerusalem and just take a day and I'll show you around?" And I said, "Okay, sure." So I thought, well, we'd have a nice meal and take a brief stroll. But I never got the meal. I never got lunch. We ended up spending like 6 hours underground visiting archaeologists that he knew. He was showing me places that I didn't even know existed. And I thought I knew Jerusalem. I'd been there before, both as a tourist and as a journalist. And I suddenly realized that there was a lot more going on under the surface, quite literally, than I had given the place credit for. And one thing that happened was people started to say things like, the archaeologists would say, "Oh, there's a tunnel that was dug by Warren," or "This tunnel, oh, that was dug by Bliss and Dickey." And I'm like, who are these people? So I got curious about their predecessors. And that's what made me think, there is a book here, because when I went to look for a book about how Jerusalem became the contested city it is today, I couldn't find it. I couldn't find a book that explained what happened. So I had to write it.
Well, I thank you. All of your readers will thank you. And I'm curious, what was it like for you to spend time in this incredibly complex region, in that troubled city? How much time did you actually spend in Jerusalem, in the old city itself? How much time did you spend above ground, and how much time did you spend below ground?
So as I mentioned, I'd been to Jerusalem before, but I did realize that this combination of religion and politics and science was what made the place interesting. So I began to go there on a regular basis, and I convinced National Geographic magazine to send me there to do a story. And they were kind enough to allow me to go back many, many times. And I got a grant that allowed me to go back even more. So I went many times, maybe 10 times or so. And I'd spend 2 or 3 weeks. It was interesting. After about 3 weeks living in the old city, I had to get out. I couldn't stay longer because living in a walled city like that, where the tension is always very high, even if there's no violence, the tension is still there. You have these different peoples jostling for control, and there's tension. And I lived in the Christian Quarter, which was fascinating to be within the city. It was a short commute for me because all the digs were there, but also gave me a real sense of a place that really is a living city. It's one of the few kind of walled cities that is still very much a living town.
One of the things that's fascinating for me in the book, and again, I love show and tell, is the way that you tell stories in this complex region. So, for example, if you go to YouTube and you look up where was the Second Temple located, you could probably get 47 different scholars that will tell you it was here based on this, it was there based on that. So you're not only living in a complex region in the present politically, but you're researching an incredibly complex field. How did you guide yourself? Do you have some kind of internal Geiger counter, litmus test, or compass for when you felt like this is the story I'm going to tell?
Well, it started with the archaeologists that I met that day when I was taken on that tour. And they were all, kind of quirky, interesting people. And then as I began to read about their predecessors, I came across these quite fantastic characters who were, all very peculiar in their own way, obsessive in their own way. They were there for secret reasons. And there was one famous archaeologist named Charles Warren who dug in the 1860s. We'll talk about him later. And, he was, when I dug into it, he was a Mason. And he really went there in order to find Solomon's temple because that's important to Masons. But he didn't talk about that. So I began to find all kinds of hidden reasons of why these people went there and what they were actually seeking. And that so stitching together these characters, it all was a piece because their themes that run throughout from the 1860s until today. Some things just haven't changed.
Yes, I lived there quite some time ago and worked as an archaeological apprentice. And so I have two questions that I'll stick together. Did you find Solomon's temple? And was there something when you look back at what you've assembled in this amazing book? Is there something that seems particularly luminous and excites you if this was an elevator pitch and you could only tell us one thing that's in the book?
Well, I'll tell you as long as you actually will read the book, and I know you have. What really amazed me, and I went into this having no idea that this is what I would find. What was interesting was less the actual objects and artifacts and buildings that were discovered, because those are fairly modest in terms of what's been found in the Middle East. I mean, there's no King Tut's tomb. There's no kind of grand city of Babylon with its remains. It's these artifacts are pretty modest. But what was fascinating was that it was Western Christians 150 years ago who began to dig, looking for biblical remains, and they're the ones that made Jerusalem a desired place. First, of course, for Christians and Muslims, it had been a sacred place, and then for Jews, a place to even think about returning to. And in a sense, it helped to spark Zionism. So this, to me, was a real shock to discover that it was Western Christians, I'm of Christian heritage, who actually made Jerusalem the contested city it is. It really had very little to do with Jews or Muslims in the beginning.
That's so fascinating, and how that plays out and all the layers of your story. And I'm using layer in a very deliberate archaeological way. And I'm wondering, given, again, the complexity of the region, the intense politics, all the varying sides coming at each other, I'm not going to ask you what they are, but were there things that you chose to leave out of the book for political, social, religious, spiritual reasons?
There was lots I left out of the book, but less for political or social or science reasons than for space. We're talking about a city that has a history of 5,000 years, that has generations of people, explorers, as well as archaeologists digging there. You have some of the most complex politics. I mean, this is the great geopolitical knot of the planet. So there's a lot to pack in. there were pieces that maybe I'll write about again someday, or I'll write in more depth about, such as Mount Zion, which is a particular place that's outside of the old city walls, that is the most diverse and densely populated place for the three religions. That you have synagogues, you have mosques, you have churches, all crammed together in this very small space, and all kinds of fascinating, interesting characters. And I do get into that a little bit in the book, but there was a whole section. I could have written a whole book. Actually, I thought about writing an entire book just about this one neighborhood that is largely overlooked, but is, contains so much of the entire history of Jerusalem in that one very, very small area. So yeah, lots that I had to leave out, but mostly simply because of space constraints.
I can relate to that as an author myself and hope that everything will end up archived, and that if someone here is now listening and thinking, this is my dissertation topic, these papers will eventually be available to you. So I'm wondering, as you think about all of this work, tell us, how long actually did you work on this book for?
It was about a 3-year project. I was working on the National Geographic article, and all of that time also on the book, because it became kind of a piece. I just began to dig deeper and deeper and deeper, and I had way too much material for just a 3,500 word article, which is all you get in magazines these days, if you're lucky.
Yes, looking at it, it's 426 pages.
Don't scare the people watching.
No, you will so be amazed by this book, and it's 426 pages, although the end is the index. And so what's your hope? Having spent 3 years of your life, I think that's how long an elephant is pregnant for. Having spent 3 years of your life on this project, what do you hope the impact is? How do you want your work and this book to contribute to a bigger conversation?
One of the things I love about you is you would know how long an elephant is pregnant. I
may have made that up.
It was very convincing.
Oh, thank you.
Well, one of the things that I had to grapple with were my own prejudices going into Jerusalem, and because everybody who goes there brings some idea of what this place is and who really owns it, or who has the lion's share of the history, or what have you, who has the most important religious center. I mean, these are just questions that go along with Jerusalem. So it was an interesting process as a reporter, as a journalist and an author, to go in and try and listen to as many people as I can, to hear these very, very different stories, to take into account my own story and not let that get in the way, and to find a way to see beyond these kind of three strict narratives, the Muslim, the Jewish, and the Christian narrative, to see beyond those. And I mean, ultimately, as a species, I think this is our big challenge, is how do we see beyond our tribal selves in order to recognize the global nature of our species? I mean, that seems to me the great challenge and hope for who we are. So to me, Jerusalem is a place you can go and see it close up. It's like looking under a microscope at this tribalism which defines our species today. So that's a piece that I came to understand, that Jerusalem is valuable. It's not a place to turn away from because of its complexity. It's actually a place to move toward because of that complexity, because I think it holds some of the seeds to help us grow maybe a different kind of society.
That makes sense. And I know that you have slides and things that you want to show us. I have two quick questions. One is a kind of speculative fiction question, which is, would your journey in writing this book have been different if you had come from a Muslim background? If you had come from a Jewish background, if you had come from Baha'i, if you had come from some other tradition?
That's a great question. I have no doubt that I would have walked into it with a different view. But my guiding light was was not ideology or religion. It was to follow these characters, to follow these people who over the past century and a half have transformed our understanding of Jerusalem. And all of them were quite different. As I mentioned before, they all had different points of view and obsessions and nationalities and religions. So for me, it was, I think anybody would have come to where I came to, and that is to just tell the story of these fascinating people who have really been lost to history. They're not just archaeologists, they're actually explorers who altered our understanding of what Jerusalem is, and thereby they altered the world.
I think so. And when you read the book, what you'll discover is the incredible range of people from all these different backgrounds. So whatever your identity was, it didn't seem to interfere. So I celebrate the book, and my last question is just tiny, which is, what's next for you?
Well, I've been writing reams and reams of kind of spin-off stories from this book in different magazines and newspapers in the past few months. So I suspect that there's just more to dig into about this topic. And as you know, because you've written way more books than I have, that as you write a book, it's like a child. It goes out into the world, but it always comes home for Thanksgiving or for the holidays, and you're always in conversation with it, and it grows and changes. So I'll always be attached to chickens in the Lost Colony, and now Jerusalem is, I think, imprinted in my DNA.
Well, great. Later we can talk about the chickens in Jerusalem, but for now, you have things you want to show, and then Nick will be answering questions from people in the audience. So thanks for this opportunity to explore a little bit of your book.
Thank you, Eli. It's been really delightful to talk with you. I kind of hate to leave this, but what I'm going to do now is to give you a little bit of some visuals, and many of these visuals come from people that from National Geographic who were with me, particularly photographer Simon Norfolk, and he's allowed me to use some of these fantastic images that he took in the past few years when we were on assignment. And this is an example of one of the underground passages that's not very well known. So first, I think an important question for those of you who are saying, yeah, Jerusalem, but what? It's somewhere in the Middle East. It's in, where is it exactly? So just a little quick geography lesson. As we move in here, this satellite photo, you'll see the Nile Delta on your left. You'll see Mesopotamia or Iraq on the right. And now we're coming down to what's right in between, which is what's called the Holy Land. Now onto the Judean highlands, boom, smack dab on top of the old city, which is where the action happens. And what makes Jerusalem so odd is that there's no port, there's no river, it's not a major trading center, but there are three faiths. There are countless shrines. I mean, the main ones, of course, that we know of are the Western Wall, which is sacred to Judaism. Nearby is the Dome of the Rock. On top of that, great Acropolis, that is the third holiest site for Islam. And then at the top right, you'll see the image looking down that the photographer took at great risk to his life at the people who are visiting the Holy Sepulchre, the place where Jesus, by tradition, was both crucified, buried, and resurrected. So this is all taking place in a very small area. If you look to your left, you'll see Manhattan and there's Central Park, and there's a reservoir in Central Park. Look to your right, that's the old city. The old city could basically sit on top of that reservoir with just a little bit of margin. So this is a very small area. And you can see here, if you follow my cursor to the right, these are the walls of today's old city. And those walls have varied quite a lot over the past thousands of years. And the thing to keep in mind why Jerusalem is so unusual in its underground world, it's not just that it's been there a long time, it's that it's built on limestone. So unlike a lot of places built on just soil where mud brick was used to build, stone was used and then reused. Because there was not much timber, arches were common. So arches have been used for thousands of years to hold up buildings, and they last a very long time. So again, you'll see, here's the outline of the city walls that shows you a little bit of the topography. Here is the sacred Acropolis, which Jews call the Temple Mount, and for Muslims, it's called the Noble Sanctuary in English. Here's this hill we'll talk about soon. Here's a spring, the only source of water in Jerusalem, a constant source of water. And then these hills that later became part of the city. Now, it's one thing when Eli was talking about what was it like being in the old city. And so I lived in the Christian quarters I mentioned. And one day I went to my local grocery store and was getting groceries. And the guy behind the counter said, "Who are you? You're not a tourist. You've been here too long. What are you doing here?" And I explained, and he laughed, and he walked to the potato chip aisle. He opened up the hatch and he disappeared. And I went down with him, behind him, and our iPhone lights could only barely make out. We couldn't even see the end of this vast underground Crusader Hall built of these enormous arches. It was a breathtaking place. I had never heard of it and didn't know anything about it. And it turned out that there had been a 20-year legal battle over who owned this, because the neighbors were the monks in the Holy Sepulchre, Coptic monks, Egyptian monks. And so there had been this tremendous court case, there had been violence, there had been this whole story, which formed a whole chapter of the book. And this was just my grocery store. So this gives you an idea of what's underneath, and so much that we still don't know what's below. And now don't be intimidated by this slide, but one slide will do 5 millennia of Jerusalem's history, I promise, one slide. So think of Jerusalem as divided into 3 big pieces. You've got that first era when the first people arrived to settle around 3000 BC, the same time that cities in Egypt and Mesopotamia are beginning to rise. And for the next 2000 years, you have a variety of peoples who come and are living there. They use the spring as the center of their village that grows into a town. You have Egyptians conquering it. You have Canaanites living there. And then sometime around or after 1000 BC, you have Judeans arriving. And I would call this the biblical millennium. This is a millennium most of us are familiar with when you talk about Jerusalem's history. And this is where much of the Bible was written during this time, or the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, as Christians call it. And there was a parade of empires that moved through. So you have Assyrians, Babylonians, Greeks, of course, which formed the basis of the holiday Hanukkah, which we're celebrating this week. We're part of that show. And then, of course, the Romans. And then things change radically at 70 CE, when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem during a civil war among Jews that turned into an uprising against Rome. And then the city was rebuilt. So really, that's a whole new chapter, because the city was a Roman city, built as a Roman city that had this history of Christian Byzantines living there. Then later, the Muslims come in. The Arab Muslims show up in the 6th century and 7th century. And then you have Crusaders, and eventually the Ottomans come in the 1500s, and they take over. And for the next 500 years, they rule Jerusalem from Istanbul. So there you go. Is that good? One slide, 5,000 years. So now on to the kind of the meat of the matter. And what I became fascinated with was this race to control and rediscover biblical Jerusalem. And it began in the 1860s. It was kind of like the Apollo program in a sense, because you had these big powers, colonial powers at the time, who were fighting for control of the Ottoman Empire, which was beginning to show signs of weakness. So in 1863, a French senator gets a permit from the Sultan himself in Istanbul to dig in Jerusalem. He digs at a tomb called the Tomb of the Kings. He found a sarcophagus that was filled with the bones of a royal woman. He declared it to be an ancient Jewish queen. It was hauled off to the Louvre, and this became a sensation. For the first time, people could visit what was said to be the remains of somebody mentioned in the Bible. This was very big news in Europe. But in Jerusalem and among the Jewish community around the world, this was simple desecration. This was desecrating Jewish graves. So at the very beginning, the first dig, there was there was this divide between those people who wanted to dig up biblical Jerusalem and those who felt that this was a bad idea for many reasons. Then in 1864, the following year, the British, who were in hot competition with the French, they formed a Palestine exploration fund that lots of wealthy Victorians contributed to, including Queen Victoria and Charles Darwin himself. And this gave Britain the edge because they sent the very, very best map makers and geologists and miners to dig beneath the city, to map the city, to find the biblical city. And the reason they wanted to do this was, in essence, to use science, the new science of archaeology, to prove religion, to prove the Bible, to prove that what the Bible said was correct. Remember, this is a time when people like Darwin were challenging this dogma. So it's really a fascinating case of science being used for religious purposes. And one of the men I mentioned who was deeply involved was Charles Warren. He was the man I mentioned was a Mason. And here's one of the passages that he explored. This is taken by our story producer just a few weeks ago. And at the time, though, this was filled with sewage. That passage was filled with sewage. And you can see looking up the height of this, and that's the street above. So the chambers and passages and tunnels we're talking about here, both man-made and as well as natural, are tremendous, and they'd never been fully explored. So one of the things that Charles Warren did was he used dynamite. He used gunpowder, because dynamite had been invented, but he didn't actually get to use it. He used gunpowder to blast his way through these tunnels in order to make maps of what was beneath Jerusalem and to find important sites like seeking the Ark of the Covenant and other treasures. Now, these explosions close to Islam's third holiest site understandably raised the hackles of local Arabs, the Arab Muslims who lived in Jerusalem. They were mad at the Ottomans because the Ottomans were the ones who gave approval for these British Christians to come in and to desecrate, in their view, the holy site. So a family called the Abu Sauds, and if you see this picture at the bottom, this is their complex, which survived until 1967, and shortly after when it was demolished. And here's what was called the Wailing Wall then, now it's the Western Wall. And the Abu Sauds were furious because they said, this guy, Charles Warren, is undermining our homes. So you have Muslims who really didn't like archaeologists, and they didn't like these Western explorers coming and poking around on their holy sites and damaging their homes. So this is kind of a prelude for what is going to become a very big and violent issue in the 20th century. So, and I'll just go through this quickly, but one of the fun questions that came up, one of the contentious questions that arose was, where was Jesus really crucified and buried? Now, the tradition was it was in the Holy Sepulchre, which was located, if you look at the map on your left, kind of toward the center of, here's today's wall, roughly. But the question was, the Gospels are clear that Jesus was buried, was crucified and buried outside of the walls. So if the Holy Sepulchre is within the walls, and clearly it's a ruse. Clearly, this traditional site is fake. And it was Protestants making this argument, in part because a little bit of sour grapes. When they arrived in Jerusalem, the Holy Sepulchre had already been divided up among older Christian sects. So they weren't very pleased with that. And they weren't pleased with this kind of large, gloomy building that was in disrepair, that was filled with people that they viewed as idolaters. They wanted a place that looked a little bit more like what they learned in Sunday school. So you had this fascinating competition between a German Kugel clock repairman who ended up as a missionary and later an architect as well as an archaeologist in 19th century Jerusalem. Fascinating character named Conrad Schick, who really is one of the untold heroes because he really respected Jerusalem's past and its present communities. And then you have Charles Gordon, who insisted that there was a site outside of town that was the true site where Jesus had been crucified and buried, largely because the hill looked like a skull. And Golgotha was the term used in the Gospels to describe the place of crucifixion. So he came up with this idea, no archaeological or scientific evidence at all, but he was a famous British general and the idea stuck. So even today, you can go to the Garden Tomb outside of the old city and you will see reams of tourists wandering through what is kind of a pleasant garden with lots of tombs. None of those tombs, however, date to the 1st century. But in Jerusalem, you find that sometimes fact never gets in the way of tradition. And our friend Conrad Schick, meanwhile, to go back, he began an archaeological dig with the Russians. So you have a German and a Russian digging, and they discovered that the walls during the 1st century, in the time of Jesus, actually had been about here, and therefore the Holy Sepulchre, in fact, would have been outside of the city walls. So here was a fascinating case of not just international competition, but of science being used to bolster a tradition. Now, in the 1890s, there was an effort to find the city of David. Of course, that was the original city. So when the city was conquered by the Judeans around or after 1000 BC, there was, according to the Bible, this large city that Solomon made more beautiful. There was these tombs of David and Solomon that were said to be grand. Here's a 19th century idea of what Solomon's tomb would have looked like at the bottom center there. But the question was, and here's the Ark of the Covenant, which had vanished, which people speculated was still beneath the city. But the question is, where was this original city? And it wasn't clear because this part of the city in pink here was, we call it the Old City, but it wasn't as old as other parts. The city of David was possibly here, what's now called Mount Zion, or here, this little extension below the sacred Acropolis. It wasn't really clear. So these archaeologists, Bliss Dickey, began to dig. And in fact, they found pottery, which showed that this little area here, close to that spring I mentioned, was the old Jerusalem, the original Jerusalem that was built by Canaanites and then taken over by Judeans. But they didn't find anything very grand. That didn't prevent other people from showing up. And we're not talking about archaeologists, we're talking about people like the British aristocrat Montague Brownlow Parker, who led an expedition in 1911. His goal was to find not just the Ark, but also the temple treasures, which he believed were hidden underneath the city of David. And it was an incredibly crazy, wacky group of people. There was a Swiss psychic, there was a Finnish poet, there was I'm not making this up, a steamboat captain who worked on the Congo River for the Belgians about the time that Conrad was writing his book about the horrors of European colonialism in Africa. So it was a very eclectic group. They, of course, failed to find anything. And when they did fail, Parker bribed the guard on the noble sanctuary, the Temple Mount, the holy site, and managed to get in. And at night, he and his team started to whack away at the rock underneath the dome of the rock, one of the most sacred sites on the planet. Now, of course, he was discovered and he and his team had to rush out of town. They barely escaped the mobs. They're lucky they escaped with their lives. And this is often, when it's remembered, been thought of as kind of a cute story of silly Westerners, but it had huge ramifications because for the Arab Muslims, it was proof that you could not trust the Ottomans who ruled from Istanbul to protect the noble sanctuary, this important site, this sacred site. So this was, in a sense, and there are historians who would back me up on this, who say that this event, which outraged Muslims around the world, helped to create the seeds of Palestinian Arab nationalism centered on the Temple Mount or the noble sanctuary. And of course, that had a huge impact on what's to follow. And I'm going to move along here because I want to have time for questions. But one thing that's not well known is that while the Christians were looking for the Ark of the Covenant, there was a Jewish competition as well. Baron Edmund de Rothschild, he put together a team, he was French, he put together a team to try and seek the Ark. Now, they pretended to be looking for the tomb of David or Solomon, but actually they wanted the treasure because they didn't want it to fall into Christian hands. So you not only have French and British and Germans and Russians competing to find what's beneath Jerusalem, you also have now Jews getting into the act because they said, this is our heritage. Why are you Christians messing with our heritage? Now, of course, the World War One intervened, and not much archaeology happened for a while after that. And I'll just give you a quick rundown of the first half of this bloody century. That first, the British conquered Jerusalem, so they won the prize. They won Jerusalem from the Ottomans. But then subsequently, Arab and Jewish clashes increased as Jewish immigration from Europe increased. And finally, after World War II and the Holocaust, British withdrew, Israel was created, and Jerusalem was divided between Israel and Jordan. Now, this is a full decade or more, a dozen years before Berlin was divided in half, but Jerusalem really was separated completely in two. And the old city, which is the part where most of the shrines are, that was in Jordanian territory, in Arab territory. But that all changed in 1967 when there was the Six-Day War. The old city fell to the Israelis, the Jordanians retreated. And for the first time, Israeli Jewish archaeologists replaced the British and French Christians who had dominated the study of the city's past. And they did all kinds of digs. Some of the largest digs ever done were done in this period, this brief period in the late 60s and early 70s. This man on the left, Benjamin Mazar, very famous and distinguished historian and archaeologist, dug up remains of the first century city that Herod the Great had adorned. And you can see here, there's a reconstruction of the world's largest ancient pedestrian bridge that led up to the Temple Mount. But there were also some really serious surprises which had political impacts, such as what's on the right. You see this man at the bottom right in blue, Meir Ben Dov, who's still alive. I spent a good deal of time with him. He discovered south of the Temple Mount, you'll see here the Dome of the Rock. So this is the sacred platform, the Temple Mount or Noble Sanctuary. Here's the Dome of the Rock. Here's Al-Aqsa Mosque. And here he discovered the remains of the foundations of these large early Islamic palaces. Now, this was a watershed or understanding of Jerusalem's history because it had been assumed by many Westerners that the Muslims really weren't that interested in Jerusalem, other than as a holy site, that they moved on, made Damascus their capital, then Baghdad. But here was proof that in the early years of Islam, Jerusalem was of great political importance. And this was so disturbing to one archaeologist that Ben Dov described as fine to, that the archaeologist suggested that he bulldozed the remains, which shows you that Jerusalem's past is always very much in the present. Now, of course, Ben Dov did not, and he immediately broadcast that he had found this in order to protect the sites. And I'm not going to go into detail about this, but many of you who've been to Jerusalem may have been on the Western Wall tunnel. What you may not know is it was begun in secret. It goes the entire length of the foundation of the Western Wall to the north. So you have the Wailing Wall here, now the Western Wall. The tunnel was designed for worshipers to be able to go and worship without disturbing people above. Problem was, there were Muslims living above. This is the Muslim quarter, and some of the most ancient Muslim buildings are there. So just like Charles Warren 100 years before, Muslims were very upset to have people of a different faith digging below their homes and their sacred sites. Now, when the tunnel's northern end was opened to tourists, there was an enormous protest which left 100 people dead, thousands injured, and it really began to unravel the attempts by the Oslo Peace Accords to try and create an Israel and a Palestine that could live in peace together. So you see here that digging beneath Jerusalem can have an immediate and important political impact. And I'm just going to mention briefly, one of the most controversial digs going on now is a tunnel that's being bored beneath what Jews call the City of David, that little spur of land, but which for Muslims is a neighborhood called Wadi Hilwa. It's mostly a Muslim neighborhood. This tunnel that they're boring is designed to reveal a street that was built in 1st century BC, 1st century AD, so the time of Herod and a little bit after, in the time of Jesus. What was interesting in what they discovered in doing this controversial dig was that the coins showed that this street was built not by Herod, who was a Jew, who was a king, but by the Roman Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate was its patron, and he was hated by both Jews and Christians. Yet here was evidence that this Roman had built a street that led all the way up to the Temple Mount, clearly glorifying not just Jerusalem, but Judaism itself. So it provides a really interesting counterpoint to some of our traditional ideas about who's the bad guy. Things are more complicated when you see these details. In fact, the street was probably modeled on the Via Sacra that was in Rome. So you have this reflection of Rome and Jerusalem that most tourists simply wouldn't get, but which archaeology has revealed. And finally, one thing that I hope you understand by now is that digging below Jerusalem is part of the conflict above, whether that's in the 1860s or whether that's in the 2010s and 20s. Now, today you have Palestinians complaining of building damage, much as the Arabs did back in the 1860s and 70s. You have patrons with strong political and religious agendas. In the 1860s and 70s, it was the French Catholics, or it was English or British Christians who were eager to both control Jerusalem as well as to show the primacy of Christianity. Today, it is mostly right-wing Jewish organizations that are funding projects like the tunnel that I mentioned. And then the other piece is that excavations in occupied territory is illegal under international law. So technically, that would mean that any digs in Jerusalem that are happening in the old city have to have the approval of Palestinians. They do not. But Israel argues that it has annexed this territory, therefore it is no longer occupied. But this remains a divisive question that makes a lot of archaeologists uncomfortable. So just to wrap up, we'll have time for questions. As I mentioned at the beginning, when Eli and I were speaking, my big surprise is that it's Western Christians who were seeking biblical remains that were central to the rise of Zionism, Israel, and today's conflict. They're the ones that made Jerusalem the city that it is today, the city that is so conflicted and contested. And as I mentioned, this digging up of biblical Jerusalem, it poses ethical issues for archaeologists. How are their finds presented? Are they used by politicians in ways that may not be accurate? Are they used by religious figures in ways that may be misleading? Is it actually ethical to dig in some places? These are important questions that are roiling the underground of Jerusalem even today. And then finally, and I certainly am not going to sit here and say I have an answer to the world's biggest geopolitical knot. However, I did come away from my experience being underground and speaking with so many archaeologists with a sense that the science that is coming out of Jerusalem, despite the religion and politics and the way it's used to further those ends, nevertheless is providing us with these a more interesting and fascinating and richer view of this city's past. And I would posit that this could offer an alternative vision for Jerusalem's past, and who knows, maybe even hope for its contested future. So thank you very much. And I want to thank National Geographic and the Society, as well as the photographer, Simon Norfolk, and the producer, Samir Al-Sharif, and of course, Jerusalem's archaeologists and residents. So now I'm happy to take some questions. Let's kick it off.
Alrighty, if you could stop sharing. Very nice. Hello, welcome everybody.
Great.
Okay. I actually have a couple. We have a couple questions in chat as well, but I did have one from Paula, who was actually supposed to. She was very excited to host this, but ended up not being able to do it. But I do have a question for her because she was interested. I guess I have two, but I'll pick one because we have questions from chat to get to. She asks, is there something more nuanced, either harder or more stressful, about doing archaeological research related to religious sites, as opposed to those that are not related to any religious sites?
Oh, yes. In Jerusalem, well, I'll give you an example. Cemeteries, which archaeologists love. They love cemeteries because when you find how people are buried, what they're buried with, you can examine their bones. There's so much data to be gained from examining a burial. But in the 1980s, when work began by Israeli archaeologists to dig in the city of David, that place I mentioned earlier, there were riots. Ultra Orthodox or Haredi were very, very upset because they viewed this as desecration, much as their ancestors in the 1860s had viewed the first digs by the French as desecration. So there are certain sites like burial sites and religious sites which are so hot button that archaeologists really have to be careful. And the Temple Mount itself, or the Noble Sanctuary, of course, is off limits to archaeologists for the most part because it is a sacred site. And that is a source of great unhappiness for a lot of non-Muslims.
Wow. Another book passage. Louisa Smith asks, what was the most surprising thing you learned about Jerusalem while doing your research?
Well, I'll come back to the most surprising thing. Well, first of all, was to see how much is underground, to see that beneath the city that tourists visit is this whole world, and not just the tourist sites like the Western Wall Tunnel. There are, in fact, most of the digging going on in Jerusalem is not being done by archaeologists, not being done by Israelis. It's being done mostly by Arabs who live in the old city, who are just digging down to create a new basement or add a room or to extend their cafe. And there were so many instances where I walked into a cafe, and after talking to the owner for a while, he would walk over, lift up a hatch, and there's a whole world below. And unfortunately, they try to keep this secret because they can be fined hugely for doing this. It's illegal to dig unless you have approval. And the Israelis are not, they don't often give approval for these digs. So unfortunately, a lot of Jerusalem's important cultural heritage is being lost as a result of this conflict between these two sides.
Wow, that seems absolutely incredible. Especially just like living on top of such history. I think coming from living in America for a long time, or I guess my whole life, sorry, I feel like that kind of gets lost on people who, if we dig down, we find dirt. Somebody, Alan Alan asks, or rather says, I spent 6 months at the Institute of Holy Land Studies in the former Bishop Gobat's school in 1972. Are there any important archaeological finds on Mount Zion since then, in 1972?
It's a great question. This is a fascinating part of Jerusalem. We talked about it earlier. It's this little extension that is just outside of the old city walls. And it's a hill that for a long time was within Jerusalem. So there are incredibly important sites, no doubt, hidden below. But because it is so densely populated with religious sites, it's very hard to dig there. But there are amazing myths and legends about this place, about tunnels that exist there, about the traditional tomb of David is actually located there, although archaeologists don't give it much credence. There's great stories in the 19th century, people going down into these tunnels, many of which have been sealed off, and seeing all kinds of amazing things, even treasure, but they have not been explored yet, although there is a chapter in my book where I talk a little bit about an Australian millionaire and a rabbi in Jerusalem who have gotten together and hope to do some digs beneath Mount Zion in the near future. So stay tuned.
And also for maybe a couple people in chat, because that sounded a little weird. I don't mean to imply that there weren't any people here before us in the United States or in North America. I just mean to imply, the history of Jerusalem is significantly different from the history that we have in the United States, both the good and bad things about the U.S. Sorry if that implied something weird. Additionally, somebody said, just asks your opinion on the novel Damascus Gate. Do you know?
Oh, Damascus Gate, yeah. Oh, I read that and I loved it, but it's probably been 20 years since it was published, and I read it when it came out. I couldn't tell you, except that I really loved it. I thought it was a fascinating picture. It was kind of a whodunit, but it's set in Jerusalem and really gets across the complexity of the place. But again, probably it's time to go back and reread that. I'm sure you all have that in stock.
Oh, absolutely. All right, I'll check right after the stream. I want to say, Eli, if you do have any questions for whatever reason you want to jump back in and ask them, feel free to. This is, you're still part of this as well. But while you're thinking on that, I do have one more question. Somebody asked, I assume it's not a particularly crowded or popular field, digging in Jerusalem, I mean. But does this impact funding or getting funding for your research?
You mean digging in Jerusalem? Does it impact your
The archaeological work that you do?
Yeah. That I do? Or that
That you're researching on, I should say.
that I'm researching. Gotcha. I'm gonna be clear. I'm not an archaeologist. I tend to break old things, so I try and steer clear of holding any old pots. Yes, Jerusalem it's a peculiar place. You have the Israeli Antiquities Authority, which is an Israeli government organization, which is in charge of all digs within Israel, and so that includes Jerusalem under Israeli law. So you can dig in Jerusalem if you get approval from the Israeli Antiquities Authority. Most of the digging that takes place there is done by members of that authority, and they often will partner with organizations that will provide funding to do these digs, because they're very, very expensive, and the Israeli Antiquities Authority has a limited budget. So the City of David Foundation, for example, also known as Elad, has quite a bit of funding to do these incredible digs. They also are associated with wanting to move Muslims and Arabs out of the City of David and replace them with Jews to bring in more Jewish settlers. So above ground, it's highly controversial. What they do below ground is pretty good scientifically, although tunneling, as we talked about, leads to all kinds of ethical issues. Is it ethical to tunnel? Mostly archaeologists do not tunnel because it is not a good practice scientifically, and also because it can cause problems with people who live above. So the archaeologists who are doing the work are generally quite good, I found, and certainly very open about what they're doing, but their funding also often comes from, let's say, controversial organizations.
Interesting. So an extra layer of complexity on top of that. Yeah. Another chatter would like to know, what is it like to be surrounded by so much history?
Well, like I said, after about 3 weeks, I had to get on a plane and come home. I love history, and the place is utterly fascinating. But because the history is so present, no matter where you are, there are at least 10 different legends or stories associated with whatever street corner, whatever rock that you find. So I found it to be I don't know quite how to describe it. If you've been to Jerusalem, you might be able to put it into words better than me, but there's just an intensity that never lets up. So I go into my room and close the door, and still I could feel it. So that is actually one of the most fascinating things about Jerusalem, is that it's a living place. You really feel not just the people living there, but you also feel the complexities of the politics and religion that have surrounded this place for thousands of years. So I would say the history there is very much alive.
Eli?
I do have a question that leans in the opposite direction, which is looking at some of the current climate research. One of the regions of the world that will be most struck by increasing heat is that part of the planet. And I'm wondering whether that threat has had any influence on the archaeology that's being done. Are people looking and saying, we have 5 years and we're going to have to get out of here?
That's a great question. Certainly, if you just get on the road and go about 15, 20 miles to the east, you're in the Dead Sea Valley, which is one of the hottest places on Earth. And Jericho is, of course, down there, and it's getting hotter. So that area is definitely, I think, facing enormous threats. The Dead Sea itself is drying up for a variety of reasons, mainly because the water's being taken out of the Jordan River, which is now pretty much a mere trickle. So I think in that area, you already have severe climate change impact that is affecting agriculture, it's affecting how people live, it's affecting their water supply and all of that. Jerusalem's in a little bit better situation because it is higher up. It is a higher altitude, and the rains still seem to be coming. It still gets winter rains, and they do have some water sources. Because of the limestone, there is water beneath that percolates down and that is there. So I think Jerusalem will probably be less impacted than certainly than the Dead Sea region or even the Mediterranean coast, which could face increased drying.
Last question for at least that I see. Ariel wants to know, rather says, wonderful presentation on a fascinating topic. Will you be doing a follow-up project?
Oh yes, I'll be doing, well, I could say I've already written a number of articles that branch off from various things that I've explored. You can go to my website, andrewlawler.com, if you want to see a list of those stories. That's probably the best way to access them. And yeah, I've got another project in the works, but not ready to unveil it quite yet.
Mm-hmm. Could I ask Eli if there's anything you can tell us that you're working on or anything like that, or is this under, you know?
No, that isn't. Because I like show and tell. I have a new book out, which is called Two Hearts Dancing.
Nice.
And I just got the little contract from my publisher for a book of Jewish stories that will probably be out some point in the middle of next year, which is called...
Oh no, what was it called?
We just lost you.
Oh no, it's called what? Oh, it looks like he dropped.
Yeah, we lost it. We'll have to put it on your website.
We will. I'll plug it on the event thing afterwards. If Eli jumps in while we're doing
Oh, there he is. Are you there, Eli?
Oh, all of you froze.
There you are.
Yeah. What is the name of the book?
The book that's out?
No, the book that you were just about to talk about.
Oh, so this was the one that's out, which is Two Hearts Dancing, and the book that will be called Texting with Angels.
Texting.
And the subtitle is Modern Jewish Tales of Magic and Mystery.
Sounds absolutely stunning. Well, I do believe that's it. I don't have any more questions. Is there anything else that you have for us, Andrew?
No, I just want to thank you for taking time and really enjoyed the conversation with Eli.
Absolutely. Eli, thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Book Passage, which I love. And congratulations, Andrew, for a great gift to all of us.
Alrighty. Absolutely, everybody. Well, that's it. Thank you for coming out. It was absolutely wonderful to see you all today, or tonight, for myself and many of you out there. If you do have anything, or if you did enjoy yourself, be sure to like the video. There's a big thumbs up button, and subscribe so that you can see more stuff like this come out. We do send out email alerts to come to live streams just like these from our email notifications, which you can find on our website. But other than that, that's completely, we're done. I hope to see you all in the next one. Thank you one last time to Andrew and Eli for coming out. That's it, everybody. I appreciate it. See ya.
Great.
Bye.
Thanks.